You are going to love chapter 19. It's called The Queen's Palace. There are so many police, whispered Tom as we walked down the big, bright red road. Everywhere we looked, there were lots of orange cones and police in yellow jackets sitting on horses. I know, I whispered back. I didn't really need to whisper, but seeing so many police officers and cars was making us both nervous, especially since we didn't have a grown-up with us. Come on, I said, pulling Tom behind me. Let's go. We walked just as fast as we could, but the red road was long and it felt as if we'd been walking for miles before we finally saw the fountain that the taxi man had told us about. Look, said Tom, pointing up at the giant black gates of the palace. The spiked ends looked like they'd been dipped in gold, and there were hundreds of people everywhere. It looked like this. There must be something happening, I said, looking around. I don't remember it being this busy when I came with Mum. The road ahead of us was filled with hundreds of people, lots of them with cameras around their necks. Some were talking and waving to the policeman. Others were climbing the giant fountain and sitting on its short walls. And yet more were leaning against the grey barriers that had been placed all along the sides of the pavements. There were people with large cameras resting on their shoulders, looking like they were starting to get ready to film something, and huge helicopters that looked like giant dragonflies humming in the sky above, making the air shake. Maybe someone special's coming to visit, suggested Tom. Let's go over there and find out, I said, pointing to the two biggest gates that lay at the front of the palace. Each gate had a golden crest that was almost as big as me stuck on the front of them, and it showed two lions dancing in front of some large spiky leaves. Two police officers, dressed all in black with large stars in the middle of their helmets, were sitting on horses in front of the gates, silently observing the crowds. Are those the Queen's police? Asked Tom, pointing to them. Shall we go and see if we can ask them to see if we can see her? I shook my head. The Queen's extra special police are the ones in the red jackets and giant hats. They're the guards of the palace. So we have to ask one of them. Come on, I'll show you. Holding each other's hands, we zigzagged our way through the crowd until we found a tiny gap in one of the grey barriers. Squeezing through it, we ran across the big red road until we reached the barriers next to where the big black and golden gates were. Trying to say, "Excuse me, sorry," as we pushed our way past the crowds was hard work, but after a few minutes we finally reached the palace gates. See, I said, pointing through the railings. Those are the special guards. We need to get near one of them. Tom pushed his face through two of the railings and stared at the palace guards. You can tell right away they're more special than the normal police because they wear bright red coats with extra shiny buttons, and they have coins on their chests and huge hairy hats that cover half their eyes. They also carry extra pointy guns and stand as still as statues in tiny little black houses. The palace guards both suddenly said, "Hut!" and marched across the front of the palace like toy soldiers. "Why do they say hut?" asked Tom, watching with his mouth open. "Because they're swapping huts," I said, remembering what my mum had told me when I'd asked her the same question. "Oh, cool," said Tom. "So what do we do now? How do we give them our note for the Queen?" "I don't know," I said, realising that I must have remembered things wrong. When I'd come with Mum, I was sure that the guards were standing much closer to the gates, and now they were so far away that we couldn't even send them a note by airmail, even if we could make a paper aeroplane that could fly straight. I was wondering what we should do when, in the distance, a bell chimed 11 times. When it had finished, a man in a bright blue tracksuit top, standing next to us, shouted, "They're going to start any minute now! Time to get your cameras ready!" A large group of people standing in the front of us quickly got their cameras out, and everywhere I looked, hundreds of people began doing the same thing. Then suddenly, everyone fell quiet. I looked back through the gates towards the palace, and both of the palace guards were standing extra still. And like a sweet wrapper being crunched together every few seconds, we heard the distant sound of marching. "Look!" cried Tom, clinging onto the gate for a better view. He pointed towards the water fountain, where from afar away little dots of red and black and gold were marching and playing trumpets and drums. "Let's get to the front," I whispered, and saying, "Sorry, excuse me, please," we pushed our way back to the front near the grey barriers. "Look over there," said Tom, prodding me as he pointed to where two large palace gates stood closed. "There's none of these barriers on the pavement there. See, we might be able to reach the guards better from there." I leaned forward just as far as I could and looked more closely. Tom was right. There were no barriers on that part of the pavement at all, which meant anyone standing there could easily pass a note to one of the guards as they marched into the palace. "You're right," I said. "Let's get closer." But before we could push our way along the barriers to the corner of the pavement, where there were none, we heard a police officer shout, "Everyone, stand back, stand back! The gates will now open!" As the crowd surged forwards and pressed us up against the barriers, we saw the large gold-crested gates begin to swing open from the inside. The palace courtyard was now filled with lots of palace guards who had silently joined the two we had seen before, and they were all standing still. "Whoa, that's awesome!" cried Tom, his eyes wide and his cheeks pink as he pointed up the main road towards the fountain. What had seemed like tiny flashes of red and gold and black from a distance had now transformed into hundreds of tall soldiers marching in time as drums and trumpets filled the air. Led by a man dressed in a shining, shimmering golden jacket, who was carrying a stick topped with a diamond that was as big as a doorknob, they all marched towards the gates with a rush of energy that made the ground shudder. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I had never ever seen anything like this in real life before. "10, hut!" shouted someone from behind the palace gates, and all the soldiers immediately stamped the ground with one foot and swivelled around on their shiny black boots to face the open gate. "The man in the gold coat," said Tom, poking me in the arm. "He must be extra special. Let's give him the note." "But look, they're going in now." Everyone around us flashed their cameras as the man in the golden coat and the palace guards behind him marched closer and closer to the palace gates. The other guards waiting in the palace courtyard suddenly began to march on the spot before beginning to march out through the gates. "Oh, I get it!" exclaimed Tom. "They're changing over. So those ones are going home and those ones behind the man in the gold coat are going to stay here with the Queen." "But," I turned around, "that means the gates are going to shut as soon as the swap is done and when they were, we wouldn't have another chance to get our note to the Queen. Tom looked at me with his mouth open, and I looked back at him with my mouth open, and I could tell we had both thought the exact same thought as each other. Feeling my hands start to shake, I pulled the note out of my coat pocket and I held it out. We had to do it. We had to. It wasn't every day that you got to go to the Queen's palace and see her special guards so up close. But even though I tried to make my voice come out, it got stuck in my throat. Those are huge," said Tom, looking at the guns that the soldiers were holding over their shoulders, and I was looking at them too. They were long and had extra pointy ends that suddenly looked more sharp and shiny and much more pointier than they had ever done a few minutes ago. And then the man in the golden jacket and all the palace guards behind him were now beginning to march past us. In just a few seconds, they would be entering through the gates, and when they did, those gates were closed. and there would be no chance of telling the Queen about Amet, and it would all be my fault. I clutched the note tightly, and I could feel my heart thumping in my throat, and my fingers began to sweat. And then, somehow, I began to move. I think when you're the most scared you've ever been in your life and have to do something you've never ever done before, your brain switches off and your arms and legs do all the thinking for you, which is why you feel as if you're moving underwater. That's what happened the moment I began running. I felt as though I was running underwater, and if someone else was doing everything for me. When, of course, they weren't. It was all me. I felt myself clambering over the barriers in front of me and slowly running out onto the red road. I could feel people's eyes turning to watch me and a sudden breeze on my face. From underneath my feet, I could feel the surprisingly bouncy surface of the road as if it was a soft red carpet, and in my hands I could feel the rough edges of the note. All around me, the sounds of drums and trumpets and the crunching of boots faded away, and then suddenly I was there, standing behind the last row of the Queen's special guards as they were walking into the palace. I watched as my right hand lifted itself higher and higher and higher until I finally touched the red-coated elbow. And without me even telling it to, my mouth opened and shouted, "Excuse me, sir!" And then that's when everything went funny. Because suddenly the world sped back up and there were people gasping and cameras flashing and the hooves thundering and the helicopters helicoptering, and before I knew what was happening, a looming tower of policemen with extra shiny stars on their helmets surrounded me, blocking out the sky. Everything started to fade away into a black sea, and I felt my legs wobble like a plate of runny jelly, and a crashing in my ears began to roar as the ground rushed up to meet me. Wow, what a dramatic end to chapter 19. Wonder how it goes in chapter 20. Join me next time. Bye for now.